One day, when I was an elementary schooler, I think probably in 3rd or 4th grade at the time, I was awoken by my mom in a big rush. It turned out she had overslept, and since she always woke me up in the morning, this meant that I too overslept. Now there was just no way I was going to be ready for school early enough to catch the bus. If I recall correctly, school started at 8 a.m., and my bus pickup time was around 7. It was already 6:40 or so, and I was still in my pajamas and hadn't even had breakfast yet. My mom decided that because of this, today we would tell the bus driver to just go ahead without me, and she would take me to school instead. This would at least give me plenty of time to get ready. I'm sitting there at the dining room table eating breakfast, still in my PJs. It was now about 6:50. We hear the bus pull right up alongside our house, about 10 minutes earlier than usual. My mom peeks her head out the door into the foggy morning and waves at the bus. She closes the door and comes back inside, but the bus doesn't pull away. Instead, after a few moments, there's a knock at the door. My mom opens it to find a man standing there in a bus driver uniform. He explained that he was a substitute driver because the regular driver had called in sick that day. He apologized and said he knew he was a few minutes early, but he wanted to get an early start on the route since he didn't know it very well yet. My mom explained to him that she was going to take me to school instead, since we had woken up late that day. At these words, he got visibly upset and said that he could wait a few minutes since he was already running ahead of schedule. My mom insisted though, saying I wouldn't be ready to go in just a few minutes. She told him to go on ahead instead. The man got very angry about this, but eventually turned around and got back in the bus and left. After that, I just returned to eating my breakfast. I still didn't even have my school clothes on at this point. At 7 a.m. sharp though, another bus pulled up alongside my house. My mom thought this was weird, of course, and went outside to talk to them directly. She came back in looking terrified, but didn't say anything about it. Instead, she told me to hurry and finish getting ready for school. At the time, I really had no idea what had happened, but my mom would end up telling me everything a few years later. When she had gone to this second bus, she found that it was actually being driven by my regular bus driver, and it was also full of all the other kids that were usually on the route. The other bus had been empty, by the way. My mom asked the driver about the substitute and about him calling in sick that day. I never called in sick. There's no substitute driver on my route, he said. The driver immediately called dispatch in a panic and told my mom to go inside and call the police, which she did without me knowing. They both reported this incident. There was absolutely no one doing my driver's route that day. Whoever this was most likely a kidnapper who targeted me specifically. I never heard anything about it again either. Not even if anyone else had ended up being picked up by this mysterious fake bus driver. But chances are, had I actually gotten on that bus, I would have never made it to school, or even back home ever again. If my mom hadn't overslept on that specific day, I would have gotten on that bus like usual, and never been heard from again. It was 2012, and my best friend Hannah had just convinced me to join her on a weekend trip up north. She had, after searching for the longest time, finally found her dream car and was planning on traveling the 900 kilometers to the very north of Sweden to buy it. It was a second-hand two-door Suzuki Vitara in a purplish kind of color, and I must admit, I didn't really share her obsession with it. With her being the closest thing to a sister that I'll ever get though, I was all too happy to join her on the journey nonetheless. Hannah and I have always had each other, ever since the cradle and onwards. Sharing each other's love for adventure, we've traveled all around the world together. At the time this happened, we were both 21 and had just recently returned from a trip in Asia. The man who was selling her this car had agreed to meet us at the small airport in Umeå. When we arrived shortly before lunchtime, it had started to snow heavily already. The very first snow of the season, no less. The parking lot was almost empty, and when I saw the man standing outside the Vitara, I felt immediately concerned. He was dressed a lot like a hunter. A lot of people in this area of the country lived a lifestyle with hunting and fishing, so there was nothing really strange about that. Still though, there was something off about him that made me uneasy. I just couldn't quite put my finger on it. He was nice enough at first, smiling and waving to us, shaking hands very firmly with both of us before walking us around this car and pointing out all the tiny little flaws it had. He showed us the work he had done on the car, showed the paperwork from the recently done engine repairs, and made the impression that he didn't want to hide anything about it. On the contrary, he made a grand show about being very forthcoming and honest. The snowing had now intensified, and we were getting very cold. He opened the car door for us and said, "I've got the paperwork at home. Why don't we close the deal over some coffee?" Against all my screaming instincts, I climbed in after Hannah, both of us now trapped in the back seat. I had no reason to feel threatened by this man who had been nothing but pleasant to us, other than these strange alarm bells going off inside my head. After the time we'd spent with him, I still couldn't quite tell what it was that made me feel that way, but I knew there must have been some sign that something was wrong, something my subconscious had tuned into maybe. The man was constantly talking. Funny, since people from north of Scandinavia are famous for never speaking a word more than absolutely necessary. He showed off the stereo as we drove, told us about the various features of the car, about the places we drove past, and about the wildlife and the nature as well. There was not a single silent moment. After about 20 minutes, though, I started to notice that we were in no way moving toward the direction of civilization. Instead, we seemed to be driving further and further into the vast snowing wilderness. It then struck me that he had us in the back of a two-door car, driving us into unknown territory, and no one knew where we were. I looked at Hannah, who was happily listening to the man tell stories about the area, and I noticed she didn't look all too worried. Maybe I was just overreacting. We drove past a group of people standing by the side of the road. Hunters planning their day or taking a break, maybe. This truly was a very different Sweden compared to the city. The car finally came to a stop outside a small wooden cottage with no neighboring houses, apart from a small cabin we'd driven past a few hundred meters down the road. That looked long abandoned, though. As we followed the man inside, he was still talking nonstop, and continued to do so until the very moment the door closed behind us. Hannah kept asking things about the car, and I could sense that her voice had a new undertone now, a thin, sharp tenseness that made me wonder if she too had started to feel that something wasn't right here. Let me put the kettle on," he said as he passed us to go into the kitchen. He let his hand touch Hannah's hair and smiled very smugly. May I use the restroom?" I asked politely, and made my way to the door with the little red heart on it. As I was washing my hands, I saw something in the stained bathroom mirror, something hidden behind the water cistern. I pulled out this rolled-up plastic folder, and as I turned the pages, I felt my blood run cold. There were very violent porn pictures that looked like they had all been snipped out of magazines. They were glued all over the paper, surrounded by cut-out pieces of handwritten text. All put together, it made out a horrifying story about how a woman was lured into a car with the promise of getting to buy it cheaply, and then quickly turned into a horror story. I know this will sound silly, but when we traveled together, Hannah and I had a special code word for whenever we felt it was time to get out of the situation. Up until this point, we had never needed to use it. We'd just joked about it. But now it came in very handy. I walked out of the bathroom, looked directly at Hannah, and said, "Potatoes, we forgot to buy potatoes. That's too bad, 'cause good God, do we need some." The look on my face must have told her the situation was no joke. "Oh, shall we get some as soon as possible then?" "The sooner the better," I replied. Hannah, always pretty and charming and capable of some very great acting, casually walked over to the man in the kitchen and tapped on his shoulder. "Excuse me, but I was wondering if I could go have a quick look at the cam belt if possible." He huffed something about it being in good shape and handed over the keys. We hopped into the car and sped off faster than the weather strictly speaking allowed. We left that car at the airport and hoped we hadn't made a terrible mistake. What if he had reported it stolen? It would be very embarrassing to explain to the police. But that didn't happen. He didn't follow us, and he never reported it missing either. We had to take the train since we had no plane tickets. The original plan had been to take the car home. We didn't want to linger too close to the airport in case he came looking for us there. Later, Hannah asked me what made me use the code word, and I told her about what I had found. Maybe it was just his fantasy, a sick game, and he would have never done anything to us. But right then and there, I was convinced we would die if we didn't get out of there. Thank God Hannah didn't need any convincing or proof, just that special code word. I truly think that if we hadn't talked about it so many times before, and about how we would handle a situation where we would need it, things would have ended very differently. Both of us knew that if either of us ever used the code word, it was time to get out, no questions asked, and I'm very thankful for that. So this happened in 2013, and I was 17 at the time. My family was looking at this house when the owner showed up and talked to my parents. He seemed like a very nice older man. He told us he had built the house himself. It was a pretty nice 2-story house overlooking a river. Anyway, I was standing back watching everyone talk, as the owner was talking and laughing. There was a break in the conversation where he turned away from my parents, and his expression completely and instantly changed from being happy to the most sinister and hateful scowl I had ever seen. I don't think the old man had actually noticed me watching him though. It probably appeared that I was on my phone, as my head was down in that moment. As soon as he turned back to them, he instantly went back to smiling. That instant change was so creepy, and honestly, it made me feel a little bit sick. I told my mom about what I had seen after he left, but she said it was a little bit weird, but maybe he was just awkward or something. We ended up buying the house in the end. We moved in, and the very next weekend, my family was going to church. I didn't feel like going though, so they left me at home all alone. I'm sitting there Sunday morning at about 11 a.m. when I hear this really loud banging outside. It was very rhythmic and was coming from the side of the house as well. I was on the other side on the second floor. Honestly, my dumbass thought maybe it was the wind blowing branches or something. It was a very stormy day outside that day. This meant I kind of brushed it off at first. It stopped after about 5 minutes. 10 minutes later, though, I could hear walking around downstairs, chairs being moved, kitchen cabinets opening, and the fridge being opened as well. I immediately quietly went to lock my door, grabbed my baseball bat, and called 911. I told them my address and I texted my mom to tell her that someone was in the house and I'd call the police. At that point, the 911 operator said that someone was 10 minutes out. I told her to be quiet because I could hear the steps coming up toward the stairs. The house was so thin that I could track where he was by hearing his footsteps. At this time, my mom responded she was on her way home. She was 30 minutes away though. So here's a 17-year-old, 5'2", 100-pound girl hunkered in her room, knowing full well that if this person came in, they'd overpower me easily and take the bat from me. I was terrified. I could hear the person walking down the hallway toward my door. I saw them turn the handle and stop. It was locked. I heard that person standing there. They didn't move a single inch. I could hear their breathing through the door. It felt like forever, but I really think it was only about 10 seconds. I heard him swiftly turn around and head back down. I heard the back door open and shut, and about 3 minutes later, the police pulled up. The 911 operator asked me if I could let them in, or if they needed to force it open. I let them know he had just left, so I let them in. No one was there, no sign of forced entry, nothing. When my mom got there, she looked at my stepdad and asked if he had changed the locks. It turned out he had forgotten. I think the creepiest part and what really validated my story was that my mom had just vacuumed the hallway. When I stepped out, I could see shoe prints that were larger than anyone in our household, and the police had not been in that area yet. The steps stopped just outside my room. The old man died about a year after that though, and there were no further problems. This just goes to show that whenever you enter a new abode, you should never forget to change your locks. I was around 16 at the time of this happening. Firstly, I'd like to explain what type of person I am, so my actions make a bit more sense. I'm an average-looking girl, a bit overweight, which for my country makes me really undesirable. For this reason, I'm not used to males hitting on me, or even considered it a possible occurrence back then. You could say I was usually the man in our group. You know, the girl that looks after every other friend when they're drinking, and if a guy is being rude or harassing someone, I'm the one to shut him down. I don't know why I took on this role. Probably because most of my friends are way too naive and nice. Well, I'm also like that to strangers when I'm alone as well. I always try my best to be helpful to people if they look confused or ask me for directions or anything else. On this particular night, I was going home from school. My high school was in the city center, and I took the bus home usually. Since the buses can get very overcrowded during peak hours, and I really hate being between crowds of people, I normally wait around 30 minutes to an hour to catch the next one. This night, I walked all the way to another bus stop, around 5 stops before the one to my school. I just wanted to kill some time so I could catch an empty bus. It was quite dark, and I was the only one at that stop. I usually don't have a problem with going out alone late at night. I'm not one of those people that have those men bad assault mentalities drilled into me. I'm just sitting there minding my own business when this 40 to 50-year-old man suddenly comes up to me. He had a very friendly face and a big smile as well, so I didn't think anything of it at first. He asked me something, and that's when I realized he was apparently Turkish. I told him I couldn't understand what he was saying, so he began to use basic Bulgarian words he knew. I could somehow get the gist that he was asking for directions. Of course, I tried my best to explain, and after I felt like he understood at least a little, I expected him to stop talking to me. But no. He came and sat disturbingly close to me and started talking to me once more in Turkish. I tried to politely ignore him as best as I could while nodding my head with a smile, looking at the timetable for the next bus. For some reason, this guy started asking me for my phone number. At this moment, I realized this was definitely not only a lost foreigner. I tried to shut this down immediately by saying I didn't even have a phone. Don't ask why I thought that was going to work. I just did in that moment. Finally, I gave in and gave him some random number. He said something else to me again in a language I couldn't understand. And then the worst happened. All this time, I was looking at the 1 minute until the bus would be arriving. I was praying for him to please not call that number in that time. Of course he did. He shoved his phone in my face and asked why it wasn't ringing. My stomach flipped. I tried to think of something real fast. I remembered that I had my old Motorola in my bag. I usually brought it to school to give to teachers, who collected phones during class. I liked playing games on it as well. This was 2014, so yeah. Fortunately, the battery for this phone was dead, so I pretended this was the reason the call was not going through. I could see this guy wanted to argue with me, but at this moment the bus came and I hopped on. I sat in the seat behind the driver as always. After 10 minutes, I got this weird feeling though. I don't know what it was, but suddenly I felt like I was being watched. I looked around, but since I was in the front seat, I couldn't exactly see everything on the bus. Luckily, our buses had the gigantic mirror on the inside that showed the back. I look into that, and I can clearly see him there, sitting in the last seat, his legs barely visible. I started to panic. I was not sure if he was following me, but I was also a very cautious person, so this wasn't exactly something I could ignore. I started checking for him at every stop, and sure enough, he was still there. I started to get paranoid. I said fuck it and hopped off the bus. The stop was at our local mall. Luckily, it was open until 10 p.m. I decided to go inside, and if he followed, I'd try to sneak out with the crowd. He followed all right. You have to understand that in my town, almost nobody goes out after 9 p.m. The mall was near empty. I looked around thinking of ways to disappear on him, but there was just no way and no one around either. The mall was a big open space with 3 floors, almost completely a ghost town. I'd easily be spotted anywhere. Now, you'll probably say you should have asked security for help or something. No, I'm in Bulgaria. We don't do that here. That literally never even went through my mind. Security is probably just some old grandpa that walks around all day. They don't actually do work or anything. If it were today, I might not be as stupid, but back then it wasn't even an option. Besides, the security was nowhere to be seen. I did the most logical thing I could do. I decided to utilize the knowledge I had acquired in the previous week. You see, the mall had a cool corridor system behind the stores. It was completely unmarked by any signs, and if you didn't know where you were going, you would definitely get lost. It was just endless white corridors that led to countless empty rooms for storage and other random things. Me, being an avid explorer and anime fan, loved going around on these corridors and pretending to be a ninja from Naruto on a mission. The things 16-year-olds get up to, am I right? I can proudly say I'd learned the correct path to the back stairway of the mall. Because I was smart and obsessed with the idea of being a spy, I decided to lure this creepy guy into the corridors and go out from the back end of the mall. I firstly entered H&M and pretended to look around, just to see if he really was stalking me. He didn't even try to hide it though. He stood outside the store just staring in. I got really scared for a moment. Then I remembered though that I was the best 007 agent out there and continued to walk around the mall. I finally slipped into the corridors, and at this point I booked the path to the staircase. I ran out and didn't stop running for 2 full bus stops. I tried looking back, but he was not there. Probably he'd gotten lost in those corridors. I proudly decided that I was the greatest hero of all time and went home very proud. Today, being a 21-year-old grown-up, I think about how stupid that is. How I'd probably be 10 times as scared today than I was back then. I hope it never comes to that though. I have a lot of creepy things that have happened to me, so someday I might get around to writing the rest. I was watching my daughter's kids while she and her husband went out of town. They had a teenage daughter. Let's say her name is Alyssa. At about 3 a.m., I was woken up by this weird rustling sound and looked out the window to see some movement. I could see a boy emerging from the bushes on the side of the house. I saw a bike tossed on the lawn that definitely was not ours as well. My first thought was that it was a burglar casing houses, but since he looked so young and came through on a bike, I figured scaring him straight would be enough for him to decide to head home on his own. I didn't want to ruin a teenager's life by calling the cops right away. I went out onto the porch, flipped the lights on, and said, "Can I help you?" in my classroom voice. The guy looked very surprised to see me, but not particularly nervous or anything. He was wearing a Letterman-style jacket, but once I got a clear view of him in the streetlights, he seemed much older than my granddaughter, gruff, and more wiry than athletic. He walked up closer to the house and said, "Yeah, actually, I'm looking for Alyssa." I gave him a disapproving glare, hoping he'd realized he came looking for a girl late at night, and a grumpy old person had answered. Now was the time to split. I was thinking what must have happened is Alyssa knew her parents were going out of town, and maybe before she knew I'd be staying over, had told a secret older boyfriend to come over while they were gone or something. It was quite late, and I was alone with several kids, so I didn't want him coming any closer to the home. I also thought it was a bit weird he'd come so late. I wanted to be sure Alyssa actually wanted to talk to him. "I'm sorry, who are you talking about?" He said, "Alyssa, Alyssa last name. This is her house, right?" I thought since he knew her full name, they must at least be friends. "You wait here." He started to walk up, and I felt a sick burning in my gut. My instinct kicked in. "Stop where you are! Freeze!" I then readjusted and said, "You stay right there. This is private property, so don't take a single step closer." I went in, and Alyssa was sound asleep, just one room over from where the rustling first occurred. I woke her up and said something to the effect of, "I don't know what the big idea was to have friends over this time of night, but you need to tell them to go home." She had no clue what I was talking about. I told her, "There's a guy outside asking for you." Confused, she got up and went to the window. She saw him and went as white as a sheet. "That guy asked for me?" "Yeah." "By name?" "Yes." "Call the police. I've never seen that guy before in my life." I called 911 immediately, but as I was on the phone with them, Alyssa started tugging at my arm. "He's coming up." I had younger kids in the house to think about, so I kept the door latched and pulled it open just enough to yell. I asked my husband, and none of us know an Alyssa last name. "Leave my property or I'm calling the police." He got angry and started screaming for her to come out. Thankfully, the police came pretty quickly, and when he heard the sirens, he grabbed the bike and took off. I watched where he was running to. He jumped into the passenger side of a car without headlights or front plates and sped off. The police followed in the same direction once I pointed them, but they didn't catch him in the end. They advised us to take all her social media details offline if she was sure she didn't know this person. They said they'd had a couple similar reports recently and were currently looking into it. I got a heavy-duty lock after that and slept in my room for the remainder of my visit. It's been months since this happened, but it was on my mind today, and I can't believe I didn't share it sooner. Back in the winter, I had returned home to New York City and was getting used to the usual schlep on the subway to get to and from work around the city in general. I hate the subway as an overarching sentiment toward the MTA. I had always called it the bane of my existence because it challenged me in all the areas I'm very sensitive about. Close proximity to strangers, claustrophobic spaces, temperature extremes, mysteriously foul smells, pests, and various vermin as well. Overall, it was convenient and tolerable on a good day, but I still had my fair share of unfortunate encounters over the years. That led me to regard the subway as a less than ideal mode of transportation around the city. This one particular early evening on a Sunday solidified my thinking. I had just left a breast cancer fundraiser event around 7 p.m. and was only going a few stops over to where my house was on the N train. My little sister and I sat chatting quietly as the train began to move. A medium-build black man with a gray pea coat and a beanie made eye contact with me and hurried over to us. He bent down real close to my face, extending his arm out for a handshake. "Hello there. You're very beautiful. How you doing? What's your name?" I sorta recoiled back, giving him a confused, "what are you doing all up in my personal space" kind of look. I shook my head in clear disinterest to make his acquaintance. All of a sudden, it was like a switch flipped, and his previously sweet tone turned immediately into ugly rage. "You fucking bitch, you think you're better than everybody? You ain't shit, you ugly bitch. You clown-ass whore. Fuck out of here, you clown-ass bitch." He screamed at the top of his lungs. I noticed everyone turning and staring in our direction. "Fuck you anyway." He made a waving off gesture while I kinda just sat there staring at him, wide-eyed and wondering what he was going to do next. His entire stance was very aggressive. He stopped screaming, and to my surprise made a direct pass to try the exact same thing on my sister, who was sitting right next to me. "Wow, you're so beautiful too. Can I shake your hand?" He reached directly over me to touch her. The fucking nerve. I extended my arm. "Hey, you leave my sister alone and back the fuck out of our space." The guy smacked my hand out of the way. Now he'd fully pushed my buttons. I stood up and realized I was about eye level with him. He must have been about 5'9", maybe 5'11" at most. "Don't fucking touch my sister." I was officially heated now. This part is a blur. I don't remember what he said as he pushed me, and we began to scuffle, but I remember landing a very sweet uppercut right on his jaw. This enraged him, of course. He had me on my back within seconds, kicking me and screaming, "I will fucking kill you!" After what felt like an eternity, 2 good Samaritans of the subway ran up behind him and grabbed him off of me. I could hear one guy shouting at him, "Leave her alone, dude, what is wrong with you?" When I looked up, I saw several horrified passengers staring at us as we engaged in a full-on brawl. Adrenaline was pumping through my veins, so everything was bright. My vision was pinpoint and I felt numb. I could hear the conductor say something over the speakers about holding the train at the next platform. I stood there shaking as the guys threw him out onto that platform and made a barrier between it and the door as he attempted to shove his way back into the car, clawing at the air, sputtering curses at me and staring me dead in the eye. The subway doors finally closed, locking him outside. He pounded on them as though possessed by a demon, screaming so loud you could see every sinew on his neck as he pounded at the glass. His eyes were so bloodshot they almost glowed red like a demon. I could hear his voice throughout the entire car echoing, "I will kill you!" Then the subway car pulled away from the station. Someone pointed to the ground. He had dropped his cell phone in the altercation. It was unlocked as well. I found out everything I could about this crazed stranger. His name, his social media handles, I saw all his selfies, and the fact he had been trying very hard and unsuccessfully to get laid. His text messages also revealed he was a drug dealer of some sort apparently. I suspected crack because of the prices, increments, and wording of the texts, which would also explain his violent outburst. I'd seen my fair share of crazy in NYC, but it hadn't gotten this up close and personal in years. I was shook and emotional following the attack. I went to the police station with my aunt and uncle soon after. I was filing a report when one of the cops at the station said, "If it turns out you stole this phone from this guy, you're going to be in a lot of trouble." Dead ass straight to my face implied I stole this phone from a complete stranger on the subway and was now spinning some elaborate web that included turning myself in at the police station. When I was filing a report of an assault as well, I wasn't wrong in thinking this guy wasn't going to be much help. I digress though. I gave them his full name and they said they had a lot of people in the system with the same exact name. Well, I have all this specific info I got off his phone. They said they couldn't use anything off of it without a warrant. They ended up taking his cell phone from me and nothing really ever came of it, except for a ginormous bruise I had from getting a sharp kick to the thigh. An officer came by my house a few months later with some photos of extremely similar looking black men, none of which I could confidently identify as my assailant. I haven't heard a single thing since I filed the report, and I couldn't find the guy on social media again. This means this lunatic is probably still out there, riding the subway somewhere, waiting for the next girl to reject a handshake so he can go batshit crazy. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened had it been real late at night with nobody around to help me. That guy was screaming he was going to kill me, and I'm sure he would have if given the chance. Last night, my friends, my crush, and I agreed to meet at my favorite bar after work. It was a bit early in the night since I got to leave work 30 minutes early. I went inside and ordered a beer for myself. There was this huge muscular guy with a long-ass ponytail sitting at the bar. The seat next to him was empty. He offered me to sit down, so I did. We had some small talk for a bit and he seemed nice enough. He asked me why I was all alone, and he kept talking about how I looked so uneasy and nervous. I should try to relax a little. It was weird, but he had an almost empty bottle of vodka in front of him, so he was clearly very drunk and I really didn't think much of it. My friends finally arrived just as I'd finished my first beer, and we went to sit at a table. I had 3 more bottles of beer, and we were having a pretty great time in all honesty. Whenever I went to the toilet, that guy from the bar was always there, asking me if I was okay. That was pretty strange, but at the time I felt just a bit tipsy, and everything was going alright so far. At some point though, I started to feel very sick, so I went outside to have a cigarette and get some cold air. The guy followed me out, and once again started asking if I was alright. I was starting to get real weirded out at this point. The bar was super full, but this guy seemed to be only watching me all night. I went back inside, ordered a glass of water, and told my friends I wasn't feeling very well. I would be going home shortly. They all offered to take me, which I'm so darn grateful for looking back. I took a sip of water, and then it all just hit me at once. I ran outside and began to vomit. I could barely stand up all of a sudden. I sat down on a staircase and kept vomiting non-stop. My friends found me a few minutes later and kept arguing about whether they should take me to a taxi or carry me home. Then that guy from the bar showed up. He kept saying he lived just down the street and I could go crash on his couch if I wanted. My coworker, who was basically an older brother to me, got real pissed off and told that guy to fuck off. They forced me to stand up, which was almost impossible at that point, and dragged me to my friend's place somehow, where I went to sleep hugging a bucket and feeling like I was gonna die at any second. This morning, I wasn't able to stand up for hours. When I did, it resulted in instant vomiting. It was 1 p.m. when I finally managed to go to the train station, get something to eat and drink, and head home on my own. I'm still shaking and sweating, and everything looks blurry. First off, this is 100% true and all happened last night. So me and my wife went to a movie last night. Skyscraper. It was okay. We got home at around 9 p.m. We live in this new development. It's middle class to upper middle class in a nice, safe area. We don't have a mailbox in front of our house. It's one of those neighborhoods where all the mailboxes are right together at the end of our street, so we don't always check it. I knew I was getting a package from Amazon that day though, so I decided to stop by and check. I noticed there was a package in there, and a letter with a typed envelope as well, made out to my name but with a return address with no name on it. It seemed to be from the street just behind us. We didn't know anyone here very well, so I opened it up in curiosity as we drove back down the street. What I read shocked me. "We're watching you, Mr. Sex Pervert," with a picture of 2 creepy eyes. I was very confused and floored. We get home, my wife is upset, I'm pissed off and confused. To be very clear, I'm truly not a pervert, as far as I know. I'm faithfully married to my wife. I don't have any particularly weird fetishes or kinks or anything. I've never even been accused of anything remotely perverted in my life by anyone, nor have I really done anything that could possibly come to mind. If anything, my wife had complained about me being somewhat bland and vanilla. Anyways, my wife was urging me to call the sheriff's department. They agreed it was creepy and they would send someone out, but couldn't promise it would be a priority. Then though, things got even weirder. We'd been home about 5 minutes total now. Our car alarm suddenly started going off. Now, this had happened before. I occasionally accidentally hit the panic button in my pocket or something while I'm reaching around. But I was sitting inside by the window, hitting the stop button, but no matter what I did, it would not turn off. Admittedly, I was getting a bit frustrated. I was already in a bad mood. I threw it down in anger and it broke my key fob, but my wife turned it off with hers. We decided to go take a drive and see what house this letter had supposedly come from behind us before the sheriff showed up to check. As we went to check though, it turned out that house number did not exist. For some reason, apparently they skipped it when numbering the street. If it had existed though, it would have been directly behind us. When we pull back up to the house, our next door neighbors and the ones across the street are both outside talking very animatedly. We go ask them what's going on. Apparently, when our car alarm was going off, So was our next door neighbors as well, and the one next to them too. They had parked in the street between our two houses. I hadn't heard theirs with mine also going off, but they were all going off at once. The neighbor across the street heard this and came out to look. Right in front of his house was this guy sitting in a black car, lights off. Once the neighbor came out, he bolted down the road as quickly as possible, with his lights still off. The neighbor tried to chase it a little by foot, trying to get a license plate, but it was too dark and they had taken off too fast. So he also called the sheriff. About 2 minutes later, 2 cars coincidentally pulled up about the same time, the one dispatched for my call and the one for his. They have no idea what to think. They asked if I had enemies, bad exes, family problems, if I'd ever been accused of anything, if I could think of anyone. But the truthful answer to all of these is no. They take a report anyways, though, take the letter and evidence, and give me a card for if anything else happens. Of course, I barely slept last night. I'm just dumbstruck and completely confused. I don't know any of my neighbors except the next door ones. Not many people even know my address either. Since they used the return address of the street behind us for an address that didn't exist, I feel like they must know the area quite well. My name and address is on our HOA website, which I guess could be where they got it possibly. But I've truly not done anything to anyone. My imagination is running wild, but I'm completely out of ideas. Was the car waiting there just a coincidence? Is this all just a prank by some insane person? My wife is scared. Any ideas on what to do next or why someone would be doing this in the first place would be very appreciated.
Mortis Media.
Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to be going into the middle of nowhere to experience some truly terrifying tales. As a reminder, the Paranormal Scholar has a promotion on her documentary, In Search of the Dead. I really do recommend it. It's really, really, really good. And if you'd like to get 50% off, it's available this weekend, only this weekend, and the information is in the description on how to obtain that. Do check it out. It's really good, or at least see the trailer. I recommend it. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This was in late November of 2012, and I was doing an install in a winery in North Carolina. It was a long day because we were working out of town, so we worked late to get it finished in one day. I started driving home around midnight and had about a 3-hour drive back home to Oakland. It's 1:30 in the morning. I'm outside of Stockton and I see this girl standing on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. She's wearing a little white dress that ends about 3 inches above her knees and is barefoot. She has long black hair flowing down her shoulders, and she is just standing still as a statue. I looked at her as I drove by, but she didn't move. Didn't acknowledge my loud truck as it passed or anything. I was pretty freaked out because you always hear stories like this, and then she just appears in your vehicle with you. But that wasn't the case. She just stood there in the night. The thing that was most weird to me was that it was cold that night, in the low 40s, as well as drizzling a fair bit. And she was wearing a short dress and had no shoes standing on the asphalt. If this was just some girl who does this for fun to freak people out, I feel like she would have been extremely cold and would have been shivering. But this girl did not move. Now, after I got home, I was thinking about it, and I searched Ghost Girl outside of Stockton, and I found a bunch of articles and stories about the East 8 Mile Road Ghost Girl. and most of the descriptions fit what I saw to a T. I never went back to the area because I moved to another state shortly after, but I want to travel back there to see what I can find one day. Has anyone else seen this girl in that area? Or has anyone else seen a ghost girl in general on the side of a road like this one? Any info would be appreciated. This story happened to my sister-in-law 4 years ago. They are uber religious, and the state of her mental stability, on top of a finger found and a police follow-up, makes this story 100% true and searchable. Last July, my sister-in-law Jackie was going back to Boise to visit for the weekend. Her husband lives in Provo and is going to law school there, as he's just graduated from a BYU chapter somewhere in southern Idaho. I'm not from Idaho, and I'm not Mormon, so I don't remember where it's located. Anyway, Jackie decided to drive from Provo, Utah, and head up to BYU to say hello to her friends just before coming back to Boise. The route she was on was I-15, which forks off into I-84 up to Boise. After you pass through Salt Lake City, the route becomes lost in a plain rolling flat of miscellaneous desert dotted by farmland here and there. Jackie left Provo, Utah in the evening, as she planned on making dinner for her husband before her departure. She ended up leaving around 11 p.m., and given the late time, she decided to forego visiting her friends at the BYU chapter and headed along I-84 to come straight to Boise. She was in between Tremonton, Utah, and Burley, Idaho, in the literal middle of nowhere, where she drove up to what looked like a body lying in the road. The location is so desolate, there are no radio channels, cell phone services, or lights to be seen for hours. This 24-year-old girl was in the middle of the desert, in a green Dodge car that already had enough problems, so it's a miracle she made it home to us without issue to begin with. She arrived at my wife's parents' house, but that was just the beginning of the story, really. Here is her account of what led to these events. At 2 a.m., she said she saw something lying on the road in the distance. As she approached it, she could see it was a body, lifeless, in the middle of nowhere. It stretched across both lanes, and she could not simply pass without running it over. Cautiously, she came to a stop and made sure she parked about 15 yards away and stopped. She opened the door and yelled, "Are you all right?" But no response could be heard. With the car lights broadcasting brightly on the body in the road, she got out of her car and slowly walked towards the person. As she got about 10 feet from the body in the road, she could see it was a dummy, fully dressed in human clothes, just lying there. Terrified, she sprinted back to her car, slammed on the door, and sped over the dummy. We received the cell phone call from her around Mountain Home, 45 minutes away from Boise. She was shaken and terribly scared, claiming she could hear footsteps chasing her to her car before she got in and drove off. We wrote it off as a freak accident, as we were all asleep and sounded too bizarre to worry of anything. As she pulled into the subdivision, she called us once again to help her unload the car and probably console given the bizarre experience. I opened the garage door and stood in the driveway with my wife, waiting for her to pull in. She came racing into the driveway and jumped out of the car, and this is where I lost it. As she opened the car door, a finger fell out. She had not stopped and drove straight to us after she came across the dummy. The person who had placed the dummy had chased her back to her car, and as she slammed the door and sped off, the person had reached out, losing a finger in the slammed door. We immediately called the police in the area, where she said she stopped at. The cops did a survey of all the hospitals in the area for a man missing a finger, and they found an exact match of his description. He was still in the hospital as he was arrested. The police did not give any details into the man's past or who he was, just simply told us to not worry about him, as he'd been arrested. I'm sure it's an anticlimactic ending to a terrifying scenario, but I will never forget the feeling that came over me when the finger fell out of her car door. I always drive with a firearm in my vehicle now, any time I need to travel. We live in New Jersey, and if you're familiar with the magazine Weird and Jay, then you'll know all about Clinton Road. For those of you who don't, Clinton Road is a road in West Milford, New Jersey, that's 10 miles of pure dark and winding of road in the middle of the woods, with no streetlights and no houses the entire way. It's considered the most haunted road in America and is a popular spot for teens and young adults to look for a scare. Popular urban legends of the area are ghosts, satanic rituals, and KKK gatherings in the woods, hybrid animals, and a spot where mafia hitman Richard Iceman Kuklinski would dump his bodies. So my friend and I took a trip there one time, and he's driving down the road and he swears he saw a fat guy with his face covered in face paint or makeup in his underwear, walking on the side of the road. Another time he said he found a red phone booth just like the ones in Britain, if not an exact replica, with an ominous purple or dark blue light shining from it. About a year ago, I was out back with my family. It was around 8, and the sun was setting. We lived in a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. The closest neighbor lived far away, and something down the field kept catching my eye, but I ignored it at first. My sister saw it too, and kept looking out towards the trees. She was getting freaked out about it. My mum said to go investigate, so me and my sister started to walk across the field towards the tree line. Big mistake. It's hard for me to describe. This was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. I didn't see it at first, and I didn't understand why my sister was so scared, until we were about 100 yards away, when I saw this creature. Tall, probably 8 to 9 feet tall, white, humanoid with an elongated head, and no face. It had long arms and peeked around the trees. We stopped in our tracks. We couldn't tell what it was. It took a few steps further out of the trees and swayed back and forth, looking at me like a praying mantis. Me and my sister ran screaming back to the house, where my mum stood, jaw dropped. She'd seen it too. I had never been so scared in my life. We grabbed the binoculars and watched this terrifying creature peek in and out of the tree line, spying on us. My grandma thought we all had a wild imagination. The sun was almost gone now, and it was getting really dark, and the darker it got, the more it moved, back and forth along the trees. It was terrifying. So we went in for the night and locked everything up tight. I couldn't sleep that night. I was hearing scratching on the roof, and at one point, a very loud bang and various noises coming from the barn. I was very afraid, that I would wake up to my animals missing. The next morning, my grandma asked if we had heard the loud bangs outside that night. She ended up taking my grandpa with her on her morning walk. I have no idea what it was, and it still haunts me to this day. About 15 years ago, my parents, my brother and I were driving around the countryside looking for a way back to the highway after going to see a house outside of the city. The vegetation is mostly tall grass and dead trees, and the dirt road isn't lit at all, which at night gives the surroundings a kind of eerie feeling. My dad's Nissan Primera, it's making his way through the countless deserted crossroads, and we are lost as hell because there was no GPS back then. As we are arriving at another crossroads, we see there's something in the middle of the road. It looks like a baby carriage. As we get closer, my father slows down on the side of the carriage, and my mother starts shouting. There in the middle of the road is a beat-up baby carriage on its side, and we can hear a baby crying. My mum is going, "My God, the baby, get the baby!" And as she goes to open her door, my dad punches in gear and does one of those movie moves where the car slides a bit and does a gravel kick. He basically wants to haul ass out of there. My mother is still crying and screaming, her door half open, and my brother and I look back just in time to see 4 guys jump out the tall grass on the side of the road, holding planks and baseball bats and other weapons. We eventually find our way to the highway and stop at a gas station right at the entrance. My father tells the gas station attendant what we just saw, and the dude goes, "Oh yeah, those guys. They're always doing that to steal cars and money. They basically put a baby doll in a carriage, and when you stop the car, they jump out the bushes and jack you for all you've got." We never went back to that region after that. My family and I have been hunting the same property in East Texas for over 10 years, and we've had some really creepy encounters with one of the locals. The property we hunt on is timber company land. It's way off the beaten path down some dirt roads. No power, no running water, no sewer. There are very few people that live in the area. Only a few scattered hunting camps and some locals. Our closest neighbors live in a trailer about a mile away, who we've come to call the meth house. Now, I'm not sure if there really is any meth going on there, but it would be hard to believe there isn't. This place has always been odd. There is a trailer sitting in the middle of a pine clearing. The brush is fairly overgrown around the trailer, almost as if the property is abandoned. There have always been broken down cars and other junk strewn throughout the front. Cow skulls and hip bones are attached to a pine tree in front of the house, going up about 15 to 20 feet. It started out with maybe 10, and over the years has grown to about 20. For a long time, I thought that was the oddest thing about the place. 2017, things started to get weirder. The front yard collection began to grow. A rotted out taxidermy of a wild hog was added to the skull tree. A doll head was fixed with horns and some kind of gown and mounted on a stick by the side of the dirt road that we called the baby devil. Tripods standing about 12 feet high. Each were erected around the trailer made out of young pine tree trunks. One day we drove by and noticed that from these tripods hung the spinal column and rib cages of some animals. We originally thought that maybe they were using the tripods to hang and clean deer, but the same bones hung for over a year and someone would usually want to dispose of the leftover carcass because the smell can get overwhelmingly fierce very quickly. So, we had no encounters with the residents and weren't even sure what they looked like. The place was creepy, but they kept to themselves until later in the season, where we had two separate creepy encounters. The first happened to a good friend. He had made a quick day trip with his wife up to the property to fill feeders and ride four-wheelers. To get to his spot, he had to go on the dirt road and drive right past the meth house. His spot is only a few hundred yards away from the house. While they were doing their thing, they began to hear some strange noises. As he listened closer, he could hear fast, high-pitched gibberish back and forth between two voices. He described it as a lot of yips, yas, and yees, and the word Jesus mixed in. They decided to get on one of the four-wheelers and investigate. They found two men squatted down, picture Gollum Lord of the Rings style, besides a large mud puddle in front of the house. They were splashing and bouncing around while furious and loudly speaking gibberish. Once they noticed the four-wheelers, they in unison stopped talking and stared like an animal that has been spooked. My buddy took off on the four-wheeler and didn't look back. The second semi-encounter happened to me and my brother. We were up there alone for this weekend and were relaxing by the fire on a pitch-black night after a long day's hunt. We began to hear something strange off in the distance. It was pipe organ music. There were missed notes and sporadic stops and starts. We laughed about how this seems like the setup in a horror movie and tried to ignore it. The music continued on and off for the next few hours. Then all of a sudden we hear crashing through the brush. This was very thick brush, about 10 feet high and 100 feet or so deep, in between our camp and the direction of the house. This didn't sound like the usual spooked deer, armadillo rooting around, or hogs coming down the trail. It was a crash made by something large, and it was close. The rest of the night was quiet. No more organ music and no more noises in the woods. Likely, just a local little old lady practicing her organ for Sunday service the next morning, drifting over for another property. Likely it was some animal that got spooked crashing through the brush, but we sure were freaked. We made a point to not be alone overnight ever again, and kept a close eye on that house from now on. This story happened when I was working the 150-mile line between Nashville and Chattanooga, Tennessee. I was working a local job on that run called the Coan Pusher, with the mountain grade starting at Coan, basically going all the way down to Chattanooga. It can be a very difficult stretch of railroad. I had the third shift on the Coan Pusher. It was all I could hold even if I didn't enjoy working nights. We basically just sat in the shop and waited to be called to help tonnage trains get to Sherwood, Tennessee. Now, all I can say about Sherwood is picture the hills have eyes with banjos added in. On the night in question, it was around 11:50 p.m. when a heavy freight train stopped over at Sherwood and requested our help to get over the other side of the mountain. We climbed on the engines and got on our way. By the time we hit Coan and started curving up the foot of the mountain, we had no visibility of anything that wasn't illuminated by the locomotive light. We had a 30-minute ride ahead of us, along with a 2-mile long dark tunnel in our path. As the clock struck midnight, we were now in the middle of nowhere. surrounded by woods filled with wolves, rattlesnakes, and a few mountain folk. Most of the mountain folk are nice, but don't let the sun set your ass in those woods. About 10 minutes later, the north portal of the tunnel was in sight. A bridge hung over the entrance. A branch line that was taken up long ago crossed it, going to another part of the mountains. The bridge is still accessible by ATV. As I looked up, I saw a campfire and people. They all looked to be dressed darkly, perhaps even in masks, and all I could see were their white faces. As we started under the bridge, we heard a thud over our heads on the locomotive roof. We proceeded through the dark tunnel and slowed just out of the south portal as the conductor looked out the back door with his flashlight. He saw nothing, so we shrugged our shoulders and proceeded on the last 10 minutes on our waiting train. It was 12:20 a.m., and we coupled on the rear of the train to push it from Sherwood. As the engineer on the head end entered the south portal of the tunnel, he radioed back to me talking about figures standing over the tunnel entrance. However, no one was there as it came in my sight. As we exited the north portal, I looked to the best I could to see on my side of the tracks for whatever had hit our roof. I saw what looked like a black cloak fluttering in the wind as we passed, but couldn't really tell. As we entered Cowan, we uncoupled on the fly, and the train continued to Nashville. We cruised on into our parking track and tied our engines down. As we got off, we had the feeling of being watched, but thought nothing as we parked our asses in the office chairs. We had no more work for the rest of our shift. We just talked and napped on and off until 3 a.m. We never did shake the feeling of being watched, so we stepped outside as I put a pinch of dip in my lip, and my conductor lit a cigarette. As we both laughed with each other, we noticed movement in the brush across the tracks. Now I must remind you that both my conductor and myself are big country boys who don't scare easy. We went over to investigate. We found 3 hooded men in the bushes, with a huge spot of my tobacco. I asked them, "What are you doing here? You understand you're trespassing on railroad property, right?" The lead guy then spoke up in a demonic, gravelly tone. "We just want what's ours." As he said this, he motioned to the top of the locomotive. We looked to see a young man on the roof at the air horn. The young man was in nothing, not even underwear. And as we all looked at him, he bolted from the roof, climbed off and ran down the tracks. As this happened, the figures turned to chase. The lead guy then turns his head back towards us with glowing eyes that we could now see. He hustled, stared at us, and gave chase with his friends. We called the cops, and after hours of investigation, they found the man's underwear, with no traces of him or the cloaked individuals. We even took them up the mountains. Cops love free train rides. There was nothing. Now on occasion we find dead animals by the shop door or locomotive, mutilated. I've even found 1 or 2 at my door at home. We still occasionally see that same fire on the bridge and get the feeling of being watched, but it's all gone by the time we return. I'm sure there's a cult somewhere on that mountain. Back in 2001, I was 21, working in a hotel bar 10 miles from my home. This was on Christmas Eve. I had to work that night. The hotel was open and I was the new kid on the job, so I had to. I closed the bar at 2 a.m., went to change my clothes, and went to my motorcycle. It was really cold at the time, so sometimes I would take a very narrow country road that cutted my trip almost to half, which was only used by residents of a few houses. I used it as I could exit near the main road on the motorcycle. A car could not. It was me and my friend from work on the motorcycle, and after maybe a mile in said road, in the middle of nowhere, near one of the houses, I saw something when passing by the house gate. I then stopped maybe 60 to 80 feet from the house gate. We both looked back, and there it was, like straight out of a movie. The typical Hollywood alien. It looked 6.5 to 7 feet tall, with grey skin, the oval face, the dark eyes, the complete package. We stared at it for 10 seconds, and it stared back at us. Then I proceeded to get the hell out of there. We both agreed to ourselves that it was just an idiot in a costume. For the next few years, I told this story to some close friends and family, just like I'm telling you now. We then went to separate jobs, but would occasionally see my friends, and we would always share a laugh about it. But we would always say, what the hell was a guy doing in an alien costume at 2 a.m. on Christmas in the middle of nowhere, in those pitch black woods? Now I'm 36 years old, and I'm a science kind of guy. I do believe that we are not alone, but I find it hard to believe 99% of the stuff we read. I would still like to think it was just an idiot in a costume, but I will forever think, what the hell? This happened about 26 years ago. My friend Jack and I were driving an RV, pulling an old truck bed conversion trailer to Yucca Valley. He made a deal with a friend of ours to trade his RV for a running truck. We were driving on Old Highway 247, where there was nothing, just flat sand and an occasional rock formation. I remember we passed a rolling sandhill overlooking winding roads of nothing, and it was dark. I was laying on the side couch taking a nap, while he called out for me to come up front and look at what he was seeing. They looked like lit balls of red fire darting past each other, going up and down about a mile ahead of us, and they seemed to be coming in our direction. As they got closer, we noticed that about 4 of them bunched together making one. Then 4 more joined them. Jack slowed down, and we were hoping they would go away, but they didn't. I opened the window, but we never heard a sound, and they just seemed to hover. Jack thought screw it, and started driving faster. That's when they all dispersed and flew towards this rock hill, and Jack floored it. We were all freaked out. As we were driving, we heard a bang from the back of the RV, so we ran back there trying to keep our balance because Jack was driving like a bat out of hell. And when I looked out the back window, I saw the trailer with something sparkling in the middle of it. I turned my head to tell him, but by the time I turned back, there were flames right where the sparks were. At the time, the red lights were gone, just gone. Jack pulled over, grabbed the small fire extinguisher by the stove, and we stood by the door, but we were too scared to go outside. With a few exhales, he puffed up his chest, swung open the door and ran out the trailer. I had a big flashlight, and I trailed behind him. The flames were getting pretty big, lighting up the desert around us, and it took a while to put it out, as we were looking above and around us. Jack jumped in the trailer to see what had caught fire, but all he found was shards of pointed metallic pieces strewn around in a dent in the bottom of the trailer bed. I jumped at the trailer because I didn't want to be standing on the ground alone. Just then we heard something about 40 feet behind us on the passenger side. I shined my light, but we didn't see anything. It was quiet, not a car or light in sight. We heard it again. It sounded like gravel, like when you scrape your shoe on dry dirt, but it was closer. Jack thought he saw something, so he took the flashlight. I, of course, was holding onto him so close I could feel his heart thump through his ribs. He turned the light on, where we heard the noise, and it looked like around 5 piles of sand, like little mounds in a row. Then the noise stopped. We started to jump out the trailer, and we heard it again. Jack beamed the light and caught the flash of some reflective diamond-shaped eyes that quickly disappeared. Then those sandy dirt mounds began moving towards us at the same time, as if something small was pushing them from behind. Jack grabbed me. We jumped and ran towards the RV doors, and I don't think either of us had ever run that fast before. He put the RV in drive and we sped off. We heard things hitting the back like rocks being thrown, but we didn't falter. We were constantly looking around, and I stayed right next to him. By the time we got to a small town, the RV was sputtering. Jack didn't understand why. It was in perfect shape before we left, so we pulled over to check the engine, and under a streetlight, he took a walk around and saw that the hot tailplate had been curled up, like folded up facing the back of the bumper. When he looked up, he saw all of the back window screens were shredded, and the rubber around the glass was hanging. He took some tools and some gloves and straightened the pipe, and we drove a bit longer to our friend's house. We told our friend what happened, but he didn't believe us. The next day when we woke up, our friend came in asking what the hell we did to the RV. So when we looked at it, it looked like the glass was etched with scratches up where the screens were shredded. We had no explanation as to what could have cut glass like that, and there were dents on the top and the back. In one spot on the side, there was what looked like an impression of 5 fingers with nail holes at the end of them and a wide thumb. Needless to say, Jack had to pay our friend for the damage to the RV, and we took his new truck and drove the long way back home, and we never spoke about it to anyone again. He kept a few of those metallic shards. He said that when he held them it felt soft, but when he accidentally dropped it, it turned sharp and hard again. He told me that he had to get rid of them because the more he handled them, the more he noticed his hands would start to blister, and he didn't want his kids to get a hold of it. I kick myself now, because if I had known back then it was so significant, I would have asked him to let me keep them. 5 years ago it was daytime, and I was driving with my son in my small truck. We were following my ex in his car, and we ended up in that same spot. It didn't dawn on me that we were going that way. I started to hyperventilate, and my son had to calm me down. You see, it was times like this that really made me hate the desert. A few years back, my girlfriend at the time and I were on a week-long motorcycle trip during the summer, hotel hopping. We stopped in a major ski resort town, which is a complete ghost town during its off-season, for one of our stays, because close by there were multiple hiking attractions, one of them being a major ski resort itself. During the summer you can ride the lift to the top of the mountain, and from there supposedly take a 20-minute hike that overlooks the entire valley. We never got there. We arrive at this practically abandoned looking ski lodge, maybe had 6 cars in the parking lot if that, and no one was there to greet us as we walked in. We kind of aimlessly walked around the lodge and finally hear someone talking outside the chairlift. I approached the guy and asked about this hike that was offered. He was a seemingly nice man, told us the directions once at the top to walk straight back where you get off at and there's a trail that bends to the left and follow it for 15 to 20 minutes. It's an easy walk, and you see the whole valley at an overlook at the end. I gave him the $10 or whatever the cost was to ride the lift, and this is where it gets creepy. As we get to the top, the guy manning the console steps out and gives us a friendly wave. Kind of a young, hefty guy. He stops the lift, and I immediately notice he must have had some severe social anxiety or was very intimidated by me, as I'm 6'2", 250 pounds, tattooed and sleeveless, wearing my leather riding vest. I'm used to people avoiding interactions with me. After stopping the chairlift, the guy turns back to me and just loses all color in his face like he's looking at the devil himself. He's so nervous he could hardly open the safety bar, so I pop it off and we hop off. I ask him about the trail and he manages to squeak out, "Over there." He points directly in front of us, and then he giggles. He giggled like a kid sneaking candy in the backseat of a car. As weird as it was, I took it as nervous laughter, and out of curiosity for his instant change of personality, I drag my feet around the lift house and take in the view for a while, trying to talk to this guy. I ask him a few questions, just being friendly to show him that I mean him no harm, but he never bites for conversation and shoots back quick, short answers. We go onto the trail, hike for almost an hour, never seeing anything but woods, and we never made it to the outlook, but came to a clearing in a field surrounded with more trees and no more trail. Total bad vibe. We almost jogged back the way we came. We came out of the woods, and the same guy from earlier acts completely shocked we came back, almost like we weren't supposed to return. He asked us a bunch of questions about the trail, all while lightly giggling after each sentence. Then it seemed as if he was going to be in some sort of trouble and hurried us into the chairlift back down the mountain. I'm an avid hiker. This trail only has one entrance and one exit, and we walked it from end to end. And Giggle Monster seemed surprised to hear we came back to a clearing like he's never known about it. The guys at the bottom of the mountain acted just as surprised. Maybe the body van was running late. I don't know. But that place had a wrong turn vibe all over it. I'm originally from the Gulf Coast of Texas, and when I was a kid growing up there, it was very easy to go from the bustling bright lights of Houston to the dark, deserted country road in only a few minutes. Not so much the case now, but ask anyone who's been far out in the country, away from any city or town, and they'll tell you that it gets dark out there. You can see the Milky Way in all its glory, but unless the moon is full and bright, you can't see your hands in front of your face. When driving, all you can see is the area illuminated by your headlights. Everything else is swallowed by the gloom. My father's family is scattered around the Gulf Coast, including cousins that lived far out in the middle of nowhere. One night, my parents, my brother, and my 8-year-old self were returning from a visit from one of those cousins just a few days after Halloween of 1988. My brother and I were in the back seat, quietly talking about a show that we'd watched once trick-or-treating had been over with. The show had talked about a shape-shifting ghost that liked to take the form of oncoming headlights that never passed. And my brother and I were talking about how weird and creepy it would be to see something like that. Our dad then mentioned that he had seen those before, and that in the back roads of Texas were a hotbed of paranormal activity. No sooner had the words left his mouth, a mile or so ahead of us, a pair of headlights appeared facing us. None of us thought anything of it, other than to laugh at the coincidence. It was nothing unusual to encounter another car or two at all hours of the night in such areas. We kept driving down the road, and with the four of us talking about various things, until my brother noticed the headlights, which were still facing us and had not gotten any closer. Cue the sudden, total silence inside our family car, as we all stared at the headlights. We kept going down this completely dark, otherwise empty road, and those lights stayed the same distance away from us, never getting any closer and never changing directions. I don't know how long we stared at them, but eventually, my brother and I began to get a little freaked out, and we ducked down out of sight behind the front seats. Not too long after that, Dad turned off that road and floored it, and the rest of the drive home was made in total silence. I never saw anything like that again, even though we traveled up and down that road on many occasions after that. And a couple of years later, we ended up moving to Illinois to be closer to my mother's family. And while the back roads of Illinois can be creepy, I don't think I'll ever be able to forget seeing those headlights keeping pace with us right after we discussed that very thing. My sister is a very short and petite girl, and her fiancé, a 6-foot guy who weighs more than 200 pounds, decided to do a little vacation type thing and rented a trailer out in the middle of nowhere. Sometime during their time there, this was around 1 or 2 a.m., they got into a bad fight, and he stormed off to another part of the trailer, and my sister was left feeling frustrated. All of a sudden she felt eerily calm, and then she said she got an image in her head of this clearing with rocks, and despite never having been there, she felt drawn to it and seemed to know how to get there, like something wanted her to go there. So she put on her shoes and her fiancé came out and asked her where she was going. She said she was going on a walk and then left. She told me she got about 50 yards from the trailer before she was hit with this extreme and heavy dread and fear, and felt that if she went any further she would die, but felt like she couldn't panic and run. So she tried her best to act calm and went back to the trailer, walked inside, closed and locked the door behind her. And before her fiancé had a chance to ask what happened, they both heard something fast, way too fast and heavy, run from the forest and towards the trailer. It ran all around and over the trailer before they heard it come up the steps to the door and stop. Her fiancé grabbed a knife and was going to confront whatever it was, but she begged him not to and told him there was nothing he could do to hurt it. So they didn't. She didn't get any sleep that night, and when daylight came, nothing was out there. The scariest thing she said was that they never heard it, whatever it was, leave. I live in Pennsylvania and have heard and found so many scary and creepy stories in this state. I'm not originally from here, and it also creeped me out to learn that Dave Paulides said the entire state of Pennsylvania is a cluster. I live in the woods. There are a lot of beautiful woods here in Pennsylvania, and the seasons are so nice, especially the beautiful fall colors. Like I said, I do live in the woods, and some creepy things happen here. I live on a very high cliff, and below are huge boulders, small caves, a creek, and miles of woods. It's beautiful and peaceful, yet sometimes creepy. I have a motion sensor light on the side near the cliff, and in the evening while doing the dishes or cooking, that light goes on and off an unusual amount of times. I always look out the window, but can never see what's setting it off. Of course, it could be bats the majority of the time. However, I have a German Shepherd, and at least a few times a month, she needs to go out to do her business, or she may hear something that she needs to investigate. Like most GSDs, she's very protective and guards very well. Sometimes I'll open the door and she will look out, then her hairs will stand up along her haunches and spine, and she will back up and refuse to go outside. This is really creepy, especially if it's one of those evenings when that motion sensor light comes on a high number of times. This dog is very brave and extremely protective. She has never acted afraid of any person or animal. She has one focus: to kill what comes in her yard or near her family. So when she does this thing, I tell you it scares me. And I certainly don't want to know what is scaring her. If anyone's dogs do this, I'd love to know. I've never had a dog do this before. Could it just be a smell? She's been sprayed by skunks and isn't afraid of smells as far as I'm aware. I'd appreciate anyone's input. I grew up on a property that connected to a game preserve, so my brothers and I practically ran wild in them constantly. Over the years, there were many times I felt there was something bad in the woods. Not all the time, but more at night. And not even every night. We also had an outhouse, so I'd have to go out in them at night more than your average kid. Flash forward to being 14, 15, and deciding to go get some plants to make a terrarium. We walked back the public dirt lane not far from the house and still touching our property, a place I walked with the dogs all the time, and went maybe 40 feet up the bank into our part of the woods. It's a gorgeous spring day, the sun is shining and everything is beautiful, and I realize I don't hear any birds, no squirrels, absolutely nothing. Then I hear a rhythmic tapping noise coming from further up in the woods. I figured it was a woodpecker and I kept looking for plants, but it keeps making noise only when I walk and falls silent when I do. It keeps getting closer and starts walking to rustle leaves, waiting for this darn bird to appear. The noise finally gets close enough that I should see this devious woodpecker who doesn't sound entirely like a woodpecker anymore. There's nothing, yet it keeps coming closer and closer, making what now sounds like someone slapping their thighs in rhythm. Now it's gotten even closer, and I realize whatever it is has been messing with me the entire time to get closer, and I have that moment that makes my insides feel like they've been melted, and I'm about to crap myself, because that is dread, because there's something bad almost on me, and I flew through the woods and threw myself off the edge of the 6-foot bank straight out of the road. How I knew I'd be safe in the road, I don't know. I just felt like a boundary it wouldn't go on in my gut. It did follow me along the road for 20 feet into the woods till I came within line of sight of my house. I didn't tell anyone for years because I felt silly. And then one night I told my mum and little brother. He just looked at me and said, "Why do you think I stopped going back there? It followed me once from the other side of the road." Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's horrors. Does anyone want to take a road trip to the desert? I certainly think not after hearing that. If you did enjoy the video, you know what to do. As always, a huge thank you to my incredible patrons for supporting the channel. For as little as $1 a month, you can help keep everything running over here. It certainly means a lot, and you get some funky prizes to go along with it, so why not check it out? If there's a story that you would like to share of something that might have happened to you, you can find all the information in the description also. So without further ado, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.